Welcome to the Riddles and Secrets of History channel. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. When we hear the word alchemist, our imagination most often paints a picture of a solitary sage in a high tower of a Gothic castle, surrounded by retorts and dusty folios. This image, firmly rooted in European culture, is only partially true. It describes one of the later chapters of a long history. But the true origins of the great work, as its adepts called their craft, should be sought not in the cool forests of medieval Europe, but under the scorching sun of Egypt, in the bustling and multilingual quarters of one of antiquity's greatest cities, Alexandria. It was here, at the crossroads of civilizations, where the African coast meets the Mediterranean Sea, that what we call alchemy was born. The word itself is a key to its origin. The Arabic alchemia has preserved the Greek root for us. The Arabic article al means the orthospecific one, pointing to a particular, important art. But what did the word chemia or, more precisely, chemia mean to the ancient Greeks? Here, historians and linguists see two possible paths, and both are likely correct. The first path leads us directly to the native name of ancient Egypt. The Egyptians called their country Kemet, which means black land. This was not related to the skin color of its inhabitants. It referred to the fertile, dark soil in the Nile Valley, which the river left behind after its annual floods. This black land, contrasting with the red land of the desert, was the source of life, a symbol of fertility and eternal rebirth. For the Egyptians, it was sacred. The art that came from this land, the art of the Black Land, was connected with the mysteries of life, transformation, and matter itself. Thus, alchemy could have initially been understood as the Egyptian art. The second path is more practical and related to craftsmanship. The Greek word chyma means casting, alloy, or flow of liquid. The verb chio means to pour or to melt. In this context, chemia is the art of melting and casting metals. This interpretation points to the metallurgical and craft roots of alchemy, to its connection with the practical knowledge of jewelers, miners, and masters who worked with gold, silver, and copper. The truth most likely lies in the fusion of both these meanings. Alchemy was simultaneously the sacred Egyptian knowledge of nature's mysteries and the practical art of transforming metals. From the very beginning, the spiritual and the material were inseparable within it. The Alexandrian crucible. But why did Alexandria, specifically, become the cradle of this teaching? Founded by Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC, the city was more than just a capital. It was a gigantic melting pot where three of the most powerful intellectual traditions of the time met and mingled. The first was the ancient Egyptian tradition itself. For millennia, the priests of Egyptian temples had accumulated vast practical knowledge. They were unsurpassed masters of embalming, preserving bodies for eternal life. This process was in itself a deeply symbolic act of transformation. They created paints and pigments that did not fade for centuries, possessed the secrets of making colored glass and faience, and knew the properties of minerals and plants. This knowledge was sacred, kept in strict secrecy, and passed down from priest to disciple. This was a proto-chemistry, inextricably linked with ritual and belief in the afterlife. The second component was Greek natural philosophy. After Alexander's conquests, the Greek language and Greek thought became dominant in the intellectual life of the Mediterranean. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle brought with them not just practical recipes, but a striving to create a single, all-encompassing picture of the world. It was Aristotle who proposed the idea of a single primary matter, the prima materia, a basic substance of which all things are composed. This primary matter, according to his teaching, took the form of four elements: fire, water, air, and earth, under the influence of various qualities like hot, cold, dry, and moist. This concept gave future alchemists their theoretical basis. If all metals consist of the same primary matter, just in different proportions and combinations of its qualities, then one metal could be transformed into another. One only needed to find a way to break it down into its components and reassemble it in the correct, golden proportion. The third element, which added mystical depth to the teaching, came from the esoteric and religious currents of the Middle East. This included Babylonian astrology, which linked metals to planets and celestial influences, Persian dualism, and Gnostic teachings, which spoke of a divine spark trapped in the material world and the path to its liberation through secret knowledge, or gnosis. In the Library of Alexandria, in its lecture halls and workshops, these three streams, Egyptian practice, Greek theory, and Eastern mysticism, merged into a single river. The artisan working with metals met the philosopher contemplating the nature of being, and the mystic seeking a path to the divine. From this synthesis, Hermetic philosophy, or alchemy, was born. Every great teaching needs its founder, its patriarch. For alchemy, this figure became Hermes Trismegistus. This is not a historical person in our usual understanding. He is the result of syncretism, the merging of two deities. On one side is the ancient Egyptian god Thoth, the deity of wisdom, writing, counting, magic, and knowledge, depicted with the head of an ibis. Thoth was considered the scribe of the gods, the keeper of their secrets. On the other side is the Greek god Hermes, the messenger of the Olympians, conductor of souls to the underworld, and patron of trade, travelers, and secret knowledge. In Hellenistic Egypt, these two deities merged into the single figure of Hermes Trismegistus, which in Greek means Hermes the thrice greatest because he was considered the greatest king, the greatest philosopher, and the greatest priest. He became the ideal founding father for alchemy, a teaching that was simultaneously a royal art of creating gold, a philosophy, and a sacred rite. Authorship of tens of thousands of books containing all the world's knowledge, from medicine to astrology, was attributed to him. Most of them, of course, were lost or never existed, but a few texts that make up the so-called Corpus Hermeticum have survived and became the foundation for the entire subsequent European esoteric tradition. Among all these texts, one stands apart. It is incredibly short, consisting of only a dozen or so aphorisms, but its importance for alchemy cannot be overstated. This is the famous Emerald Tablet, or Tabula Smaragdina. According to legend, the tablet was found by Alexander the Great himself or, in another version, by Apollonius of Tyana, in the tomb of Hermes Trismegistus, who was holding it in his hands. The text itself was said to be carved on a single piece of emerald. Historically, we know this text from Arabic translations dating to the 6th to 9th centuries, and later from Latin ones. But its brevity and aphoristic style suggest a much more ancient origin. The Emerald Tablet is not a practical recipe. It is the quintessence of alchemical philosophy, its main operating principle. And it sounds like this: that which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below, to perform the miracles of the one thing. This phrase, as above, so below, became the axiom, the alpha and omega of the entire Hermetic worldview. What does it mean? It proclaims the fundamental principle of correspondence between the macrocosm and the microcosm. The macrocosm is the universe, the world of planets, stars, and the great cycles of nature. The microcosm is man, and in a narrower sense, even the substance in the alchemist's retort. For the adept, this was not just a beautiful metaphor. It was a working law of nature. It meant that the universe and man were created from the same blueprint. the laws governing the movement of Saturn are reflected in the properties of the metal lead. The processes occurring in the human body, health and disease, obey the same principles of harmony and disharmony as the entire cosmos. And most importantly, the chemical processes in the laboratory flask, dissolution, heating, crystallization, were not just chemical reactions, but a miniature reenactment of the great acts of the universe's creation. Thus, the emerald tablet gave the alchemist not only philosophical comfort but also a practical justification for his work. By studying the small, he could know the great. By acting upon the small, the lead in his crucible, he could imitate and direct the great cosmic forces to achieve his goal. The human soul, the planets, and the metals were bound by invisible threads of sympathy and correspondence. The alchemist in his laboratory was not just mixing substances, he was becoming a co-creator, assisting nature in its eternal striving for perfection. He had received the key, the first and most important one. Now he had to study the map of the world that this key unlocked, a world composed of fundamental elements and principles. Armed with the Hermetic principle of correspondence, the alchemist received not just a philosophical right to his work, but a kind of map of the cosmos. Before he could begin transforming matter, he had to thoroughly study its structure, to understand its internal laws and composition. His universe was not a chaotic collection of atoms as we imagine it today, but an ordered, living organism built on several fundamental ideas. Prima materia. The most foundational of these ideas was the concept of the prima materia, or first matter. This is not a specific substance that one could find in nature, mine from the earth, or synthesize. It was a philosophical concept denoting the original, unified, formless state of matter from which all things were created. Alchemists believed that at the very beginning of creation, there existed only this chaotic, potential substance, containing within it, in a hidden form, all possible forms and qualities. The entire visible world, from the stone underfoot to the stars in the sky, from base lead to noble gold, represented only different manifestations, different solidified forms of this one first matter. This idea was the cornerstone for the alchemist. It provided the theoretical justification for the very possibility of transmutation. If both lead and gold are fundamentally made of the same dough, then turning one into the other is not the creation of something new, but merely a process of purifying and restructuring what already exists. The adept's task was to find a way to dissolve the base metal, to break it down to this initial chaotic state of first matter, and then, like a divine creator in miniature, to reassemble it, but this time in a perfect, ideal form, the form of gold. Therefore, the search for the Philosopher's Stone was simultaneously the search for a way to work with this mysterious first matter. The 4 elements and 3 principles. But how does the diversity of the world arise from this unified chaos? Here, alchemists relied on teachings inherited from Greek philosophy, primarily from Aristotle. According to this model, the prima materia, being formless itself, manifests through the interaction of 4 fundamental elements: fire, air, water, and earth. It is crucial to understand that for the alchemist, these were not the substances we call by these names. Fire was not a candle flame, water was not the liquid in a glass. The elements were immaterial carriers of primary qualities. There were 4 such qualities, organized into 2 opposing pairs, hot and cold, and dry and moist. Each element was a combination of 2 of these qualities. Fire is the embodiment of hot and dry. Air is hot and moist. Water is cold and moist. Earth is cold and dry. This system was remarkably logical and allowed for the description of all processes in the world. Heating a substance meant adding the quality of heat, evaporation was a transition from moist to dry. Any change in the material world was seen as a shift in the balance of these four elements. For example, when water was heated on a fire, it first became warm, the element of air, and then turned into steam, which alchemists also classified as a form of air. If the steam met a cold surface, it would condense back into water, the element of water. And if water was frozen, it became ice, a solid substance exhibiting the qualities of the element earth. Thus, all substances in the world represented a unique proportion of these four elements. Lead, for instance, was dominated by earthiness and wateriness, making it heavy, dull, and fusible. In gold, however, alchemists believed the elements were in a perfect, ideal, and harmonious proportion, which gave it its luster, incorruptibility, and nobility. The alchemist's task was to use the fire of his furnace and various reagents to alter this elemental balance in metals, to burn out excess moisture, add internal fire, and purify them of coarse earthiness. However, to describe the world of metals, which was central to alchemy, four elements were not enough. A deeper level of analysis was needed to explain not only the composition but also the inner nature of substances. Thus was born the doctrine of the two universal beginnings or principles, sulfur and mercury. Again, as with the elements, these were not the specific chemical elements we know today. In alchemy, sulfur and mercury are philosophical principles, the metaphysical father and mother of all metals. Sulfur, often called sulfur in Latin treatises, was the masculine, active, hot, and fixed principle. It was the principle of combustibility and structure. Sulfur was responsible for a metal's color, its ability to withstand fire, its hardness, and its form. It was, in philosophical terms, the soul of the metal. Mercury, mercurius, was the feminine, passive, cold, and volatile principle. It was the principle of metallicity itself, the ability to melt, flow, shine, and take any form. It was the spirit of the metal, its life force. According to this doctrine, all 7 known metals of the time were born in the bowels of the earth from the union of these two principles. This union, or conjunction, was analogous to a procreative act. Mother Earth acted as a giant alchemical retort where, under the influence of heat and time, the principles of sulfur and mercury combined to create metals. If their union was pure, harmonious, and occurred under ideal conditions, a perfect child was born, gold. But if the sulfur was impure and combustible, and the mercury cloudy or earthy, then imperfect, sick metals were born, lead, tin, copper, iron, or silver. Silver was considered almost perfect, but it lacked the maturity and color of gold. This theory completely changed the alchemist's view of his work. He now saw himself not just as a craftsman, but as a kind of physician to the metals. His task was to accelerate the natural process. If nature, over thousands of years in the Earth's depths, slowly purifies metals, bringing them to the state of gold, then the adept in his laboratory had to reproduce this process in weeks or months. He had to take an imperfect metal like lead and, through his art, separate it into its impure sulfur and mercury. Then, each had to be repeatedly purified through distillation, sublimation, and other processes, before being reunited in a perfect, pure proportion. The result of this new, perfect union was to be gold. Over time, this dual system was supplemented by a third element, especially in the works of the famous alchemist and physician Paracelsus in the 16th century. He introduced the third principle, salt. Again, salt was not just common table salt. In the alchemical triad, salt represented the material body, the principle of solidity, substance, and crystallization. It was the passive vessel that gave form and held together the active soul, sulfur, and the volatile spirit, mercury. Thus, a perfect threefold system was created, which perfectly corresponded to the as above, so below principle. Every object in the world, like man himself, now consisted of three parts: a body, salt, a soul, sulfur, and a spirit, mercury. This conceptual framework made the alchemist's world completely interconnected and meaningful. Working with metals became work with the fundamental principles of being. By purifying sulfur, mercury, and salt in his flask, the alchemist believed he was simultaneously working on the purification of his own body, spirit, and soul. Material transformation was inseparable from spiritual growth. The quest for the Philosopher's Stone. With this detailed, multi-layered map of the universe before him, the alchemist could finally focus on his main goal. He understood what the world was made of, but to change it, he needed a tool, a universal key capable of unlocking matter's internal lock and releasing its hidden potential. This key, this holy grail of the material world, became the central object of a quest that lasted for more than 1,500 years. In history, it is known by its most famous name, the Philosopher's Stone. The name itself is misleading. The word stone conjures an image of something hard, simple, and taken from the ground. But in alchemical treatises, this substance was described very differently. The Philosopher's Stone, or lapis philosophorum in Latin, had many names, each revealing one of the facets of its supposed nature. It was called the magisterium, meaning mastery or perfect work, indicating its ability to teach an imperfect metal to become perfect. It was named the red tincture, emphasizing its color and ability to stain or penetrate the structure of other substances. Sometimes it was called the great elixir or the fifth element, quintessence, meaning the purest celestial essence extracted from the four earthly elements. The appearance of the stone was also the subject of numerous, often contradictory, descriptions, likely due to different stages of its preparation or the deliberate obfuscation of the uninitiated. Most often, it was described not as a common mineral, but as a heavy, dense powder that could be melted. In its less perfect form, it could be white, and in its final, most potent form, it was red, saffron, or even purple. Some texts claimed it resembled crystalline glass that melted easily in fire but did not burn. Others compared it to wax or salt. The only thing all descriptions agreed on was its extraordinary density and its ability to dissolve in molten metals. The great work, Opus Magnum. The search for this mysterious agent was not a single action. Alchemical tradition divided the entire process into two major parts, two works. The opus minus, lesser work. Its goal was the creation of the white stone or white tincture. This substance was believed to be capable of transmuting imperfect metals not into gold, but into silver. For the alchemist, silver was not just a cheaper version of gold. In the system of planetary correspondences, silver was the metal of the moon, while gold was the metal of the sun. The moon symbolized reflected light, purity, the feminine principle, and the soul. Achieving the silver stage was a huge success. It meant the adept had learned to purify matter of its coarse impurities and bring it to a state of near-perfect purity. The opus magnum, great work. This was the step toward the ultimate goal. Its culmination was the creation of the red stone. It was this substance, alchemists believed, that possessed full power. It could turn any metal, lead, tin, mercury, into the most perfect of earthly substances, gold. Here again, it is important to step away from modern notions. The desire for gold was, in the vast majority of cases, not driven by a thirst for wealth. Of course, among those who called themselves alchemists, there were many fraudsters and adventurers who dreamed only of profit. But for the true adept, the philosopher, gold was primarily a symbol. It was the material equivalent of spiritual perfection. Gold does not rust or tarnish. It is impervious to time and decay. It shines like the sun, reflecting divine light. To turn lead, a dull, heavy, sick metal associated with the planet Saturn, a symbol of time and decay, into shining, eternal gold meant to perform an act of redeeming matter. It was proof that imperfection could be conquered, that decay could be turned into eternity. Projection and multiplication. How did the adepts believe this mysterious stone worked? The process of using it was called projection. Imagine an alchemist's laboratory. In a special furnace, an athanor, lead is melting in a clay or ceramic crucible. When it reaches a liquid state, the alchemist takes a tiny grain of the philosopher's stone. Its weight might be 1,000th or even 1/10,000th of the weight of the molten lead. To prevent the powder from instantly burning on the surface, it was often wrapped in a small piece of wax or paper. Then, this tiny pellet was solemnly dropped into the crucible of molten metal. What happened next was described not as simple mixing. The philosopher's stone acted like an enzyme or a leaven. It didn't just dissolve, it infected the entire mass of lead with its perfection. It penetrated the very essence of the metal and instantly restructured its internal composition, correcting the imbalance of its sulfur and mercury, purifying it of all impurities, and raising it to the highest level of the metallic kingdom. The entire process, according to some descriptions, could take mere minutes. Before the adept's eyes, the dull gray liquid would begin to shine with a noble yellow light and, upon cooling, would turn into an ingot of the purest gold. Moreover, the philosopher's stone was believed to possess the power of multiplication, or self-reproduction. It was thought that a portion of the gold produced with the stone, if subjected to repeated alchemical processing, could itself become the philosopher's stone, and an even more potent one than the original. The language of symbols. Because the recipe for this miraculous substance was considered the greatest secret, it was never described in plain text. Instead, alchemists created a complex system of symbols and allegories designed to hide the knowledge from the profane while transmitting it to those ready to understand. The green lion. Alchemical engravings often depict a fierce green lion devouring the sun. The green lion is not an animal but a name for a key ingredient, a kind of universal solvent. It often referred to a corrosive substance like antimony or green vitriol, iron sulfate, or a strong acid. It was called a lion because it was able to devour, that is, dissolve, almost all metals, including gold itself, the sun. This act of devouring was the first step in breaking down matter, returning it to the state of prima materia. The red lion devouring the sun, this symbol represented a later, more important stage. Here, the sun is ordinary earthly gold. Alchemists believed that to create the stone, one must take the most perfect existing substance, gold, and make it even more perfect. To do this, it had to be killed, dissolved in a corrosive agent, the lion, and then resurrected in a new, purified, and energetically charged form. The rebis, perhaps the most important and multifaceted symbol representing the philosopher's stone in its final state, was the rebis. The word comes from the Latin residential bina, meaning dual thing or two things in one. In engravings, it was depicted as an androgynous being, a figure with one body but two heads, one male and one female. The male head, often crowned and marked with the symbol of the sun, represented the purified masculine principle, sulfur, the king. The female head, with the symbol of the moon, represented the purified feminine principle, Mercury, the queen. This figure, the rebes, standing on a dragon or a sphere, symbolized the end of all duality. It reconciled all opposites, male and female, sun and moon, soul and spirit, fixed and volatile. It was the symbol of the great union, the sacred alchemical marriage, from which the perfect child, the Philosopher's stone, was born. The rebes is the stone, a state of perfect balance and unity that the adept sought. It represented matter that had reached its highest, divine state. Having understood what he was searching for and having studied the language in which this quest was described, the alchemist had to set out on the most difficult and dangerous path, the path of the great work. Having realized the lofty goal he was striving for, the alchemist set out on a path that was not a single experiment, but a long, multi-stage, and perilous process. This path, leading to the creation of the Philosopher's Stone, was called the Magnum Opus or the Great Work. This was more than just a name for a series of chemical operations, it was the main pursuit of an adept's entire life, a spiritual pilgrimage reflected in the processes occurring within the laboratory flask. It is crucial to understand that for an alchemist, his own internal state and the events in the retort were inextricably linked. The success of the work depended not only on the right ingredients and temperatures but also on the purity of thought, patience, and spiritual fortitude of the operator himself. The entire Magnum Opus is a journey of matter and spirit from darkness to light, from chaos to order, and from imperfection to divine harmony. The stages of the great work alembic. The classical tradition describes this path through a series of color stages. The changes in the color of the substance in the alchemical vessel served as milestones for the adept, indicating which stage he was on. Most often, 3 or 4 main stages are identified, each with a profound material and spiritual significance. 1. Negrito, the black stage. The first, initial, and longest stage was called Negrito. This was the black stage, the stage of darkness. On a laboratory level, Negrito began when the alchemist placed the initial materials, his prima materia, often a mixture of certain minerals or metals, into a hermetically sealed vessel. This vessel, often spherical and called the philosophical egg, was placed in an athanor, a special furnace designed to maintain a constant, gentle, but continuous heat for weeks or even months. Under the influence of this slow, digestive heat, the substance inside the vessel began to decompose. It blackened, turning into a dark, formless, often foul-smelling mass. This process was called putrefaction. The alchemists spoke of the death of the substance. The original components had to die, to lose their initial form and structure, so that something new could be born from them. In engravings, this stage was often symbolized by a black crow, a skull, or a coffin. It was an image of returning to the primordial chaos, to the very prima materia from which everything originated. However, this death in the flask was merely a mirror of what was supposed to happen in the soul of the alchemist himself. For him, the Negrito stage was a period of the deepest introspection, self-analysis, and spiritual trial. It was a descent into his own inner darkness. The adept had to confront his fears, doubts, vices, and imperfections. This process is often called the dark night of the soul in mystical traditions. The alchemist had to mortify his ego, his pride, his attachment to the material world. He had to acknowledge his own imperfection, his own inner lead. Without this internal purification, without passing through this spiritual blackness, further progress in the work was considered impossible. 2. Albedo, the white stage. After a long period of darkness, if all went correctly, changes began within the vessel. The black mass gradually started to lighten. This was the sign of the second great stage, albedo, from the Latin albus, meaning white. On a laboratory level, the white stage meant that the process of putrefaction was complete and the matter had begun to purify itself. This often occurred through repeated cycles of distillation and sublimation. The dark matter was heated, its volatile part, the spirit, evaporated, rose to the top of the vessel, condensed on its cool walls as white crystals or dew, and then flowed back down to wash the solid residue. This process, repeated over and over, symbolized purification by water and fire. The spirit washed the body. As a result of this long baptism, the entire mass in the vessel was eventually supposed to become a shining white, like snow or polished silver. Symbolically, the appearance of the white color signified resurrection. The crow was replaced by a white dove or swan. The death of matter in the nigredo stage was followed by its rebirth in purity. This was the first dawn. For the alchemist, this was a stage of enlightenment. He had successfully passed through his inner darkness and attained a new, purified consciousness. This marked the achievement of the lesser work, obtaining the very white stone capable of turning metals into silver. 3. Citronidas and rubedo, the yellow and red stages. In some alchemical systems, particularly later ones, an intermediate stage was identified between the white and the final red stage. It was called citronidas, from the Latin citrinus, meaning yellow. During the yellow stage, the white substance from albedo, with a further careful increase in heat, was supposed to acquire a yellow or golden hue. This transition symbolized the dawning of the sun. If albedo was associated with the moon, purity, and the soul, citronidas was the sunrise, the appearance of the sun that would warm and color the white matter, preparing it for the final transformation. Finally, the culmination of the entire work arrived, the rubedo stage, from the Latin ruber, meaning red. To achieve it, the alchemist had to significantly increase the heat in the athanor. The white or yellow substance was subjected to a powerful, yet precisely controlled, fire. Under its influence, it was supposed to pass through a whole palette of rainbow colors, sometimes called the peacock's tail, which was considered a good omen. Then, at last, it would acquire a stable, deep red color. This was it, the red stone, the philosopher's stone in its perfect form. Symbolically, rubedo represented triumph, resurrection in full glory. The white queen, moon, purified mercury, and the red king, sun, purified sulfur, entered into a chemical wedding in the flames of the furnace. The result of this sacred union was their child, the rebes, the androgyne, the philosopher's stone. The symbols of this stage were the phoenix rising from the ashes or the pelican, which, according to legend, feeds its young with its own blood, symbolizing the sacrificial and life-giving nature of the stone. For the alchemist, reaching rubedo signified the complete transformation of his personality, an apotheosis, a union with the divine principle. He became an adept, one who has attained. He had not just created the philosopher's stone, he had, in a spiritual sense, become it. The elixir of life and the Taoist parallel. The transmutation of metals, however miraculous it seemed, was only one facet of the power attributed to the philosopher's stone. The great work promised the adept something far more valuable than mountains of gold, victory over time, disease, and physical decay. The stone was the key not only to wealth but to longevity and, in its boldest interpretations, to physical immortality. The panacea. To achieve this, the stone had to be prepared in a special way. A small amount of the red powder was dissolved in a suitable liquid, most often pure wine spirits or especially prepared essence. The resulting drink, which could be red or golden, was the legendary elixir of life or elixir of immortality. Its principle of action flowed directly from the alchemical worldview. The human body, like everything in nature, was seen as a microcosm. Sickness and aging were considered the result of an imbalance of the elements within the body, an internal rust. The elixir acted as a universal remedy, or panacea. Upon entering the body, it worked just as it did on metals. It expelled all imperfections and restored the original, ideal harmony. It was believed that a single drop could cure any disease, rejuvenate the body, and, if taken regularly, extend a person's life for hundreds or even thousands of years. The Chinese connection, external versus internal alchemy. This idea was not unique to Europe. In fact, European adepts were, in a way, students of the much older and more developed tradition of Chinese Taoist alchemy, where the search for immortality was the central theme. Historically, Chinese alchemy was divided into two major branches. Weidan, external alchemy. This was closest to the European quest. Taoist alchemists experimented for centuries to create pills of immortality from minerals and metals. Their primary ingredient was not sulfur or mercury as philosophical principles, but a specific substance, cinnabar, mercury sulfide. Its vibrant red color was associated with life force, and its ability to break down into mercury and sulfur and then be recombined seemed to model the process of overcoming death. However, this path was exceedingly dangerous. Many emperors and nobles who took these elixirs, often containing highly toxic mercury and arsenic compounds, suffered from poisoning and premature death. Niden, internal alchemy. Perhaps due to the failures of Weidan, another school of thought gained prominence. The adepts of Niden concluded that the true ingredients for immortality were not in the external world, but within the human body itself. In Niden, the body is the laboratory. The ingredients are the three treasures of a person: Jing, vital essence; Qi, vital energy; and Shen, spirit or consciousness. Through practices like meditation and controlled breathing, the adept learns to refine these inner substances. The goal was no longer to live forever in the physical body, but to create a new, subtle energy body or immortal fetus that could exist independently of the physical form after its death. Thus, at different ends of Eurasia, alchemists sought an answer to the same fundamental question, hoping that through secret knowledge, the very nature of time could be overcome. The secret language of alchemy scroll. Such profound and potentially powerful knowledge could not be made public. Alchemists were convinced their sacred art was too dangerous to be written down in simple instructions. This belief in the necessity of secrecy gave rise to one of alchemy's most characteristic features, its complex, convoluted, and impenetrable language. The reasons for this secrecy were twofold. Pragmatic fears: what would happen if the recipe for making gold became common knowledge? Rulers feared economic collapse. The greedy and unprincipled would use the knowledge for personal gain, causing chaos. Spiritual purity: the great work was a sacred path. It demanded moral purity, patience, and humility. A person with impure thoughts, driven by pride or greed, was unworthy of this knowledge and would inevitably misuse it. Alchemical texts were therefore designed as a filter to weed out the unworthy. To achieve this, alchemists developed a complex language of allegory. Instead of writing, "Take antimony sulfide and dissolve gold in it using aqua regia," they would write, "Let the grey wolf from the east devour the king, then let the king be thrice committed to the fire, until the wolf is completely consumed by him." The king almost always meant gold. The queen meant silver. Their marriage or konyangsho was an allegory for a chemical alloy or solution. The grey wolf was often a code name for antimony, used to purify gold. Dragons and serpents usually symbolized volatile and corrosive substances like sulfur, mercury, or various acids. The eagle symbolized sublimation. The Ouroboros. Among the diversity of alchemical symbols, one stands out for its universality and depth: the Ouroboros, the serpent or dragon biting its own tail, forming a closed circle. This image was a concentrated expression of the entire alchemical doctrine. It symbolized eternity and the cyclical nature of creation and destruction, life and death. It was the visual embodiment of the principle solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. It symbolized the unity of opposites. The head, creation, joins the tail, destruction, showing that all dualities arise from a single source. Most importantly, it was the main symbol of the prima materia itself, the undifferentiated, self-sustaining chaos that contains everything in potential. This secret knowledge was passed down not in public books but in special handwritten treatises. One of the most famous and beautiful is Splendor Solis, Splendor of the Sun. Created in Germany in the mid-16th century, this manuscript is a masterpiece of book art. Its value lies not so much in its text, which is typically obscure, but in its magnificent miniatures on parchment. Splendor Solis contains 22 full-page illustrations that are a coded storyboard of the great work. These images were meant to be read and meditated upon. For instance, one miniature shows a noble lady with pale skin, symbolizing purified matter, the queen, standing naked in a stream of water under a starry sky, symbolizing the stage of washing and purification. Another illustration shows a series of 7 flasks, each set over an allegorical landscape, displaying the sequence of color stages of the Magnum Opus. The black crow in the first flask, the white swan in the second, then the peacock, and finally, the red phoenix in the last. A series of images where a child or youth is depicted playing in various scenes is especially interesting. This is the symbol of the philosophical child, that is, the nascent stone. We see him drowning in the sea, dissolution. Then he is fished out. He fights a 3-headed dragon, overcoming the 3 principles, and finally returns home to his parents, the king and queen. Every detail in these miniatures, the color of the clothing, the gesture of a character, an animal in the background, had its own deep symbolic meaning, understood only by the initiated. Treatises like Splendor Solis, the Mutus Liber, Mute Book, consisting almost exclusively of images, or Atlantifugens, Fleeing Atlanta, where each engraving was accompanied by a musical fugue in verses, were not textbooks but tools for meditation and comprehension. They appealed not only to the reason but also to the intuition, imagination, and spirit of the adept. They were the embodiment of the Hermetic principle itself, to reveal while simultaneously concealing. Behind these complex texts and mysterious images stood real people whose lives were dedicated to the great work, geniuses, mystics, scholars, and, of course, the inevitable companions of any secret knowledge, charlatans. The practitioners, sages, mystics, and frauds. Behind the mysterious symbols and encrypted treatises, behind the smoke of laboratory furnaces and the gleam of retorts, stood living people. The history of alchemy is not only a history of ideas but also a history of its practitioners, people of flesh and blood who dedicated their lives to the great work. Their fates were as varied as the art they served. Among them were geniuses ahead of their time, sincere mystics seeking contact with the divine, and, of course, skillful deceivers who used the aura of mystery for personal gain. To understand the full complexity of alchemy, we must look into the faces of those who stood before the Athenor. Paracelsus, the father of iatrochemistry. One of the most monumental and controversial figures on this path was a man who went down in history by the name of Paracelsus. His real name was Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, and this name alone spoke of his immense ambitions. He lived in the first half of the 16th century and was a true rebel of science and medicine. Paracelsus publicly burned the works of Galen and Avicenna, who had been unquestionable authorities in medicine for centuries, declaring that the buckle on his shoe knew more than these ancient physicians. His main contribution was that he decisively shifted the focus of alchemy from the transmutation of metals to the healing of man. He became the founder of a new direction that came to be known as iatrochemistry, or medical chemistry. Paracelsus was convinced that the task of the alchemist was not to make gold, but to prepare medicine. He viewed the human body as a chemical system governed by the three main principles we have discussed: mercury, sulfur, and salt. Health, in his view, was a harmonious balance of these three principles. Disease was a disruption of this balance. Therefore, diseases were to be treated not with herbs and bloodletting, as was customary, but with chemical preparations that could restore the lost harmony. He used alchemical methods, distillation, calcination, sublimation, to create potent medicines from minerals and metals: antimony, arsenic, lead, copper, and iron. He understood that these substances could be poisonous, but it is to him that we owe the famous phrase that became the basis of all modern toxicology and pharmacology: all things are poison, and nothing is without poison. The dosage alone makes it so a thing is not a poison. In essence, Paracelsus took the alchemical toolkit and applied it to create the first chemotherapy. John Dee and Edward Kelly, Alchemy and Espionage. A completely different facet of alchemy is represented by the fates of two Englishmen who lived in the same 16th century, Dr. John Dee and Edward Kelly. Their story is a thrilling example of how alchemy intertwined with high politics, espionage, and radical mysticism. John Dee was one of the greatest minds of his time, a mathematician, astronomer, geographer, and advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. He amassed the largest library in England. But the main passion of his life was not the study of the visible world, but communication with the invisible one. He believed he could receive knowledge directly from its source, from angels. For this, he needed a medium or scryer, a person capable of seeing visions in a crystal or a polished piece of black obsidian. That person became Edward Kelly, an adventurer of a highly dubious character. Kelly had previously been convicted of forgery, for which, according to rumors, his ears had been cut off, which he hid under long hair. For many years, Dee and Kelly conducted angelic conversations. Dee would ask questions, and Kelly, gazing into the crystal, would relay the answers he claimed came from angels. They even recorded an entire angelic language they called Enochian. Their quest eventually led them to the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II in Prague, which was then the capital of European occultism. Kelly claimed to possess a small amount of a red powder and reportedly conducted several successful demonstrations of transmutation, turning mercury into gold. Whether this was true or a clever trick, we will never know. But their story ended sadly. The emperor, having failed to obtain the secret of mass-producing gold from them, imprisoned Kelly, who died during an escape attempt. John Dee returned to England, where he was met with poverty and oblivion. Nicholas Flamel, the legend of success. But when it comes to the most famous legend in alchemy, no figure can compare with Nicholas Flamel. He became the archetype of the successful adept, a man who not only sought but found the philosopher's stone. Historically, Nicholas Flamel truly existed. He was a French scribe and manuscript seller who lived in Paris in the 14th and early 15th centuries. He and his wife, Perronelle, were well-off bourgeois known for their philanthropy. These are the historical facts. The legend that made him immortal in another sense was born much later, mainly thanks to a book published in 1612, 200 years after his death. This book, allegedly written by Flamel himself, told an amazing story. One day, a very old and mysterious gilded manuscript, known as the Book of Abraham the Jew, fell into his hands. After 21 years of struggle, he traveled to Spain, where a learned Jewish scholar helped him decipher the text. Returning to Paris, Flamel worked for 3 years in his laboratory and, on January 17, 1382, he successfully turned half a pound of mercury into pure silver. A few months later, he performed the great work, obtaining gold with the red stone. The legend says that he and his wife used their newfound wealth for charity and, having created the elixir of life, achieved physical immortality, faking their own deaths to continue their travels around the world. This story is almost certainly a fiction, a beautiful mystification. But the myth proved stronger than history. The image of the humble Parisian scribe who, through patience and piety, managed to unravel the greatest mystery became incredibly popular and inspired generations of new seekers. The charlatans and their tricks. However, for every true philosopher like Paracelsus or complex mystic like John Dee, there were dozens of those called puffers or charcoal burners, common charlatans. The promise of untold riches inevitably attracted fraudsters of all kinds. Their methods were varied and quite inventive. The false-bottomed crucible. A charlatan would place a bit of gold at the bottom of a crucible, cover it with a layer of wax mixed with coal dust, and then add lead or mercury in front of a gullible patron. The heat would melt the wax, releasing the hidden gold. The hollow stirring rod. A rod would be filled with gold powder, its end plugged with wax. While stirring the molten metal, the wax would melt, secretly releasing the gold into the crucible. The activities of these people did a great deal of damage to the reputation of alchemy, turning the royal art into a synonym for fraud in the eyes of many. The final transmutation, from alchemy to chemistry. By the 17th century, the world in which alchemy flourished began to change rapidly. The Age of Reason, or the Enlightenment, was dawning. The worldview on which the great work was built, a belief in a living, spiritualized universe governed by sympathies and correspondences, began to crack. Robert Boyle and the skeptical chemist. The key figure in this transitional period was the Irish natural philosopher and scientist Robert Boyle. In 1661, he published his work The Skeptical Chemist. This book became a true watershed between two eras. Boyle subjected alchemy's theoretical foundations to devastating criticism, particularly the doctrine of the four elements and three principles. He argued that these concepts were too vague and could not be proven experimentally. Boyle proposed a revolutionary new approach. Instead of speculating about metaphysical principles, a scientist should focus on what can actually be observed, measured, and analyzed in the laboratory. It was Boyle who introduced the modern definition of a chemical element, a simple substance that cannot be broken down into simpler components by any known chemical methods. The task of chemistry now became the discovery and study of these basic, irreducible building blocks of matter. Chemistry separated from philosophy and mysticism, becoming an independent experimental science. Alchemy's practical legacy. However, it would be a huge mistake to think that chemistry simply rejected alchemy. The new science was the direct heir of the old art. For centuries, alchemists had accumulated a colossal amount of practical knowledge and made numerous discoveries that formed the basis of laboratory practice. Processes, they perfected and systematized distillation, sublimation, calcination, coagulation, filtration, and crystallization. Apparatus, the very glassware we associate with chemistry today, retorts, flasks, and alembics, was developed and popularized by alchemists. Substances, in their endless quest, they discovered and described a multitude of new substances. The Arab alchemist Jabir ibn Hayyan, Jibir, developed methods for producing strong inorganic acids, sulfuric, nitric, and hydrochloric. Alchemists also discovered or isolated elements like arsenic, antimony, bismuth, zinc, and phosphorus, first isolated in 1669 by Hennig Brand of Hamburg. Isaac Newton, the last of the great adepts. Perhaps the most striking and paradoxical example of this transition is Sir Isaac Newton. In the public mind, Newton is the ultimate rationalist, the creator of the laws of universal gravitation and mechanics. However, analysis of his personal archives, which only became widely available in the 20th century, revealed a completely different Newton. His true, secret, all-consuming passion was alchemy. He left behind more than 1 million words written on alchemical topics, more than all his works on physics and theology combined. Newton believed that the ancient alchemists possessed a lost divine wisdom, prisca sapientia. He sought in alchemy the key to understanding the active, living forces in nature. The figure of Newton symbolizes the end of a great era. In him, two worlds were mixed, the old Hermetic world of a living, spiritual nature and the new mechanistic world of strict mathematical laws. After him, alchemy as a serious practice of investigating nature finally receded into the shadows, giving way to its daughter, chemistry. The resurrection of alchemy. At first glance, it might seem that the history of alchemy is a story of grand failure. But did the great work fail? The answer depends on what we consider the true goal of the alchemists. If we see them merely as primitive chemists trying to make gold, then their venture indeed failed. But if we look deeper, it becomes clear that the philosophical core of alchemy has proven surprisingly resilient. The idea of transformation, having failed in the realm of physical matter, was reborn with new vigor in the realm of the human spirit. Carl Jung and the psychology of alchemy. This rebirth occurred in a completely unexpected context, the office of the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung in the early 20th century. While studying the myths, dreams, and fantasies of his patients, Jung stumbled upon old alchemical treatises. He was astonished. In these convoluted, irrational texts, he saw not primitive chemistry, but a detailed map of the human psyche and its path to wholeness. Jung proposed that the alchemists, without realizing it, were projecting their own unconscious inner processes onto the matter with which they worked. Their laboratory operations were an external reflection of a profound inner drama. When Jung analyzed the stages of the great work, he saw a striking similarity to the process he himself called individuation. Individuation, according to Jung, is the natural process of psychological development, the path to becoming one's true self by integrating the conscious and unconscious parts of one's personality. Negrito, the black stage, became a perfect metaphor for encountering one's shadow, the repressed, unrecognized parts of the personality. Albedo, the white stage, corresponded to the integration of the anima, the unconscious feminine image in a man, and the animus, the unconscious masculine image in a woman. Rabido, the red stage, symbolizing the chemical wedding of the king and queen, became for Jung an image of the final goal of individuation, the realization of the self. The self is the archetype of wholeness, the unifying center of the personality that reconciles all opposites. Thanks to Jung, alchemy was given a second life. It transformed from a forgotten historical curiosity into a powerful tool for understanding the depths of the human soul. Alchemy's enduring cultural echo. The legacy of alchemy is not limited to psychology. Its fundamental ideas and images are woven into the fabric of our culture, continuing to live in literature, art, and cinema. The quest for the Philosopher's Stone has become a universal metaphor for any deep striving for perfection. We see it in Goethe's Faust, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, and, of course, the Harry Potter series, which introduced the ancient ideas to a new generation. In conclusion, the search for the Philosopher's Stone was not in vain. Perhaps the true goal of the alchemists was never to turn real lead into real gold. Perhaps the laboratory was merely a stage for a much more important drama, the inner transformation of the seeker. The true lead was the imperfect, divided, mortal human self. and the true gold was the whole, harmonious, enlightened personality that has achieved unity with its soul and the world. In this sense, the Philosopher's Stone is not a substance to be found or created. It is a state to be achieved. And this quest, this eternal great work, continues to this day in the soul of every person who strives to become better, to know themselves, and to find their place in the universe.